Let's take a little bit more of a closer look at how he plans to address the tough economic situation in particular. As has been widely reported, the 48-year-old Poroshenko made his fortune in the candy business. He's the so-called chocolate king, but he also owns a television station and has holdings in shipping, agriculture, and autos. Bloomberg puts his wealth at around $1 billion. The tycoon speaks Ukrainian and Russian, both fluently. That's a vital asset for someone who will have to bridge the politics of both countries. But he has some big experience there as well. As Rowie mentioned, he's been a longtime member of the parliament, where he briefly served as speaker. Poroshenko has also served as foreign minister as well as economy minister under two different administrations. Well, joining me now from New York with more on the economic impact of these elections is Charles Ortel. He's managing director at Newport Value Partners. It's an independent research firm with a focus on politics and macroeconomics. Mr. Ortel, thanks so much for being with us. I wanted to ask you, first of all, President-elect Poroshenko is selling the idea that improving the economy is the way to reunite Ukraine. But how possible is that, given the fact that much of the economy, as we've been talking about, will be under forced austerity under the IMF bailout deal?
Well, I think this is the end here of a holiday weekend, and people like to be hopeful. But the brutal reality facing Ukraine is that it is indeed hostage to Russian energy interests, oil and gas. It is behind on its bills. It is heavily in debt. And Putin has a lot to lose by appearing weak here, both internally inside Russia, vis-a-vis the situation in Ukraine. And we have not yet heard from Mr. Putin as to how he regards this.
And that will be very important. But Poroshenko is also a pragmatist. As we said, he speaks Russian fluently. He's also a former economic minister. Does that give him the sort of juice he needs to deal with Putin?
I think in the Ukraine and in Russia, we're talking juice is equal to cash. And what the Ukraine does not have is cash. And what Russia does have is it has very positive cash flow, notwithstanding the sanctions, and a large, or I should say a small external debt. Indeed, if you count the sovereign wealth funds of Russia, they actually have a positive cash pile. You contrast that with the Western nations who, watching these most recent elections, are hardly unified and are heavily stretched financially. This is a period of great uncertainty, I think, and I wish the man well, but this is a tough road to hoe.
You know, we were talking at the beginning of the segment about the fact that this president-elect wants to draw closer to the European Union. Of course, in many ways, that's how all of this started last year. What do you expect to hear from him in that regard? How do you expect him to navigate these very treacherous waters?
Well, I think the European Union is one thing, and for another time we could debate how well that's worked. I think the bigger anxiety for Russia is that, notwithstanding the original agreements way back when, the West and Ukraine are pushing on a path of drawing Ukraine into NATO. And when you look at the military bases inside the Ukraine, an important one that no one talks about for the moment is up in Kharkiv, in the center north of the country. That is a very strategically important base. The last thing that Mr. Putin and Russia want to see is any kind of a deal where Ukraine gets drawn into NATO and NATO fighters are in that base. So I think, you know, that's a sticky wicket.
Absolutely. Well, let me turn a little bit, maybe not the macro scale, but the micro scale here in the country of Ukraine. What do you think we're going to see in terms of the business community itself? What kind of impact can Poroshenko have on that? I mean, we've got gas prices rising. We've got the value of the Ukrainian currency dropping. Can he really have an impact on that in the short term, do you think?
Very difficult in the short term. And what he would have to do, and the relics of the Soviet impact, the Eastern European impact on this country, still obtain in the Ukraine. There's too much bureaucracy, too much government. The tax system is too high. There's too much waste and inefficiency, and all those types of problems can be cured, but not in months. It takes, indeed, many years, as we found out in this country. So, as I say, I do wish the man well, but I think economically he has a weak hand, and politically, the person who really calls the shots, Mr. Putin, has not yet opened his mouth.
Now, we have seen some positive reaction from the Russian markets. They went up after this election. How do you think the broader international business community will respond, especially here in the United States?
Well, I think at the moment, the broader business community is watching benchmark interest rates on the euro, which are dropping. And because of that, you're seeing asset prices rising around the world. So you have to sift through the various factors that are dictating market reaction. I don't think what's going on in Ukraine is the principal driver, or the theory that we won't enforce rigorous sanctions on Russia. I think it's more that we're seeing pronounced weakness in Europe, concern over whether the euro hangs together, and every expectation that the European Central Bank will keep rates on the floor, perhaps negative.
Okay, thank you, Charles Ortel from New York. We really appreciate you joining us this evening.